We have a few questions. Obviously, slide is open if anybody wants to ask questions, and I am going to start. I think what I found very interesting about that conversation is if you look at what Rory and Helen spoke about, in some ways they took two different positions to get to the exact same place, which is rights and responsibilities, putting your words into action, celebrating the potential of people, and understanding that service users have rights and responsibilities, which are our values. I guess the question to the panel is, how important are a set of vision, mission, and values to the delivery of services for those most in need? John, I'm going to start with you from the trustees' perspective.
Thanks very much. I think our vision, mission and values are absolutely central to what we do. Rory talked about a pervasive kind of mindset that comes from the Victorian era, I suppose, about the deserving and undeserving poor. And in a previous event, I acknowledged that you can, without thinking, you can fall into that mindset, even with starting with the best of motives. And the challenges every day that you face in services where you may be dealing with people with chaotic behaviours, for example, frustrating to deal with. It would be easy, in spite of yourself, to fall into that mindset. The second perspective I'd bring to that is something you also referred to, Rory, which was the mindset of policymakers. And I'm very familiar with that because I was one for a long time, including in the housing area. And it can sometimes be a little bit of a caricature of policymakers. They also find wrestling with these issues very frustrating. And in the case of, say, the HSE, where they're dealing with a huge range of stakeholders, they can easily get into the mindset of blaming the provider of the service for the problems that seem to be insoluble. And I've seen references in the media to the homelessness industry, quote unquote. Now, we're not an industry. We are driven by our vision, mission and values to serve whoever comes our way and to seek out those that we are best placed to serve. As David mentioned earlier, we're not in the business of relentless expansion either. We've turned down suggestions that we take on various things because in conversation with the senior management team and the trustees, we took the view that we're not best placed to do certain things. We're not prepared to take unreasonable financial risks that could put the rest of the organisation in jeopardy. So we're not a business, but we have to be business-like in the way we approach the management of money and so on. But ultimately, it's about people. It's about everybody in this room being driven by the vision, mission and values to serve our service users as best we can. And at senior management level and at trustee level, having a louder input from service users is an important objective for us going forward. Because there can also be a tendency, whether it's among policymakers or among organisations like our own, to think we know best. And that's always dangerous. You should always stop and reflect when you get to start feeling like that. I see Dermot nodding his head, but among this panel, he probably does know best, you know.
I always know best, John. Rory, I just want to bring you in a question that's coming up and specifically relates to something you noted when you were talking, and you can share with John the mic. And it is, do you think there is any chance that we are going to actually have a referendum on housing as a right anytime soon? If yes, what gives you that hope? And if no, why not?
Yeah, it's a very good question. The current government committed in their programme for government to have a referendum on housing, and there was a number of us who were involved in a group called Home for Good, which includes a number of the community law centres, a couple of other NGOs working in housing. And we've been working for many years now on trying to progress a referendum on a right to housing that would put a right to housing in the Constitution. And we were worried that this programme for government commitment didn't say a right, but it was vague about housing. Now, the Minister for Housing set up a housing commission, and one of its tasks, it was about 2 years ago, was to look at a referendum on housing. And that group met, and they had a conference, which I was at, and they have now produced a report, which I understand is with the Minister for Housing, or is very close to being with the Minister for Housing. I think it's with the Minister for Housing. And my understanding of what we saw in the media was that most of the people in that committee recommended that it would be a right to housing, and it would be a justiciable right. But there was a small number of people, one of them being a developer, who opposed that proposal. But it seems, I think that the government will probably have a wording from that commission, which my understanding, will be a very good, strong wording. I hope that they could move quite quickly with that. If we don't have an election before the end of next year, there's no reason why you couldn't have a referendum in the summer with the local and European elections. But if it doesn't happen under this government, I think it's very likely to happen under the next government, particularly if we make it a key kind of public demand within this election for a right to housing. So I'm actually quite hopeful that it will happen.
And that's a very optimistic note, which is good. David, a question for you, and it relates to Northern Ireland. And it is, what's the plan for DePaul Housing establishing itself in NI?
I think more and more from a bigger picture point of view is how we kind of translate our business from an All-Ireland kind of perspective. Now, that's not being political. That's around, that we have two jurisdictions side by side. And we are in a unique position to understand the political realities on both sides of the border, and to bring learning from either side of the border, to learn from the north, and the north to learn from the south. So I think in the way, I suppose politically, not that we have a view on this, that we do and are in a unique kind of position in terms of determining where and how we go. So one of the big kind of areas that we are kind of looking at the moment is the cross-border element, cross-border communities. We're in Derry. We've been talked to by people in Donegal and Sligo around our presence there, as an example. And again, people are talking to us every day, guys, around what and how we do stuff, and asking us to step into the space. And I think one of the big themes that we would kind of want to get across is finding our place and our place in the world. In terms of our response, if we look at where housing is in Northern Ireland, there is no vision, or hasn't been any vision, apart from DePaul around Housing First in Northern Ireland for 10 years. And I would say through the work and through the advocacy that we've had in place, we single-handedly have been responsible for the introduction of Housing First in Northern Ireland. And we have obviously our services in Derry and Belfast. So where does housing go with regards to that? Certainly advocacy in terms of the house building programme, making sure that both north and south single units are built, because people we serve are not going to be able to be moved on unless that occurs. The right housing in the right place. But a legitimate question, have we got a role in the provision of housing? We've obviously started off DePaul Housing in the last 3 years, and we are getting on our feet. I would want us to use the learning in the development of DePaul Housing to certainly ask the question, can we get involved in the provision of housing in the north? But I think for us, it's either, we're not going to come up with the answers around the housing question because we're such a small player. We have to kind of determine what unique role we have to play in the provision of housing north and south. So that will be the case with the north as well.
Thanks, David. Helen, I've one for you. And it's, what challenges have you faced? I guess I want to ask you two questions because there's another question I really liked as well. But what challenges have you faced in your journey and involvement with the Paul? And then what inspires you to keep going?
Okay, thank you. I think there have been quite a few challenges. I think the most daunting is that, you know, we want to end homelessness globally. I mean, that is something. But unless you aspire to do that, what's the point? I mean, obviously you have to make your way towards that. But I think sometimes it's being daunted by the idea of, are we making a difference? What difference are we making? And I think what inspires me is that actually if you're making a difference to one person, if you're housing one person or preventing one person from being homeless, that is huge. For that person, it's everything. And so it's worth doing all we do for that one person, and then the next person, and the next person. And obviously, scale means that you're helping more and more people. And also, I think perhaps to make a difference, to be able to say, because of everything that you do on the ground, we have an authentic voice to be able to talk to people about what should be done about the big issues on homelessness, whether it's here in Ireland, whether it's at the UN, whether it's at local council level. I think that's really important. And I guess the inspiration for me is that I think I'm a bit like your mother. Well, I'm not like your mother, but I'm like it's that social. It is that social justice thing, and I think that's where my faith is. You know, it's difficult to find faith sometimes and continue with faith when there've been so many things that are wrong. But in terms of social justice and trying to do what's right, I think that's what inspires me, and to make a difference to that one person.
One person at a time, right? Yeah. Guys, I have a question for you. What's our mission? Can't hear you. Still can't hear you. There's like over nearly 200 of you in the room. What's our mission? Okay, so it's to end homelessness. So I have a question for the panel on that. If our mission is to end homelessness, and Rory, you spoke about it a little bit when you talked about the principles of health and, you know, seeing homelessness as a health in the same way as health is seen. I would argue from our side in homelessness that we lobby constantly asking for health equity for homeless people. So we know, and there's been a lot of questions about mental health, youth mental health, child mental health, health. So these are a lot of questions coming in. I guess I'm just going to ask all of the panel to answer this. But in a word or two, how do we address that? Like, how do we lobby the government? How do we raise our voices? And what are the things we need to do to ensure that we don't just address the accommodation issue? So, Dave, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah. So I'm pretty passionate on this around the generational opportunity or risk that we face with the huge building programme that we're going to have in the Republic of Ireland. The numbers aren't enough, and the numbers aren't enough in terms of the scale and degree of social housing that we are going to build and the proportion of that within the overall market. But we have real lessons of what's gone right, the 30s and 40s development of Dublin in terms of local authority housing, of which I come from a corpo house, and now in terms of what can actually go really well and right in terms of the building of communities. But we know what can go wrong as well. And therefore, what thinking we put into now in terms of how communities are supported, and more importantly, how our constituency, which is the people who are most marginalised, and people coming out of direct provision, and new people coming into the country are incorporated because their living experience, and Rory talked a lot about this earlier on, is directly linked with their communities and their housing status. And I think that's a question we haven't posed properly and needs to be posed really, really quickly.
Okay, Helen, straight to you.
Thanks. So I've got an answer at a very macro and minor level. So the big picture, I'll talk about the UN again, because it's actually huge that the UN is now recognising homelessness and is going to measure it, and nation states are going to be expected to report against it. Now, that's not going to solve homelessness overnight, but it's probably the biggest single thing that will make a difference in the long term if it actually works. And so that's huge. So to continue to lobby at that level, so we need to lobby our governments to make sure they're on board with the United Nations and to get homelessness as part of the next Sustainable Development Goals. On a very, very smaller level, I got a taxi from the airport today to make sure I was here on time, and the taxi driver asked me where I was going, so I told him, and then, of course, we got engaged in a conversation about immigrants. And I thought, okay, I can either sit back here and fret about my speech and worry whether I'm going to be here on time, or I can actually engage in a conversation. And so I decided I did the right thing, and I engaged in a conversation and spoke about the work that DePaul Island are doing and tried to put it in a way that he was persuaded. So I think we influence the people we come across on a daily basis as well.
Thanks, Helen. Rory, straight to you.
Yeah, I think that there's a number of things that, for me, in terms of the housing crisis and the homelessness crisis that's within that, it is something that I mentioned earlier about challenging the normalisation of that in society. And part of that, I believe, is telling the story in terms of what is the real impact of homelessness. And it is all these things on physical health, mental health, on children. And because it's, when I look at, marriage equality and repeal, and you look at how social change, even our general attitudes towards mental health, how have they changed? How has culture changed? It is when people talk about it. And there is something for me about how can we empower more and more people who are living in homelessness, affected by it, to speak in the public, to tell, because they're completely hidden, and to tell their story, and to tell this is what's happening. I don't know if people heard, there was actually 2 people I heard during the week. One was on Liveline. Was anyone here, the guy who was homeless, about to be made homeless? He's working as a security guard. Well worth listening back to. He's in utter shock that he's about to be evicted. But he's a single man in his late 50s, security guard. But if you listen to him and you just hear the impact, and then similarly there was someone else facing eviction talking about it, and there's something about telling the human story that people connect with. And I feel that we need to take risks in that sense of bringing that voice and experience into the public sphere. And as homeless service supporters and providers, I think there's a role in that. And it's a difficult one, but I think there is a role in not staying silent about the damaging health and mental health impact of homelessness. And ultimately, the other side of that is changing policy, and how do we change policy at a macro level, at a government level, to actually build the public housing, to ensure everyone has a home and a right to housing. And that is engaging in conversations all around us, but it is about voting, it is about engaging in public advocacy, it is about raising our own voices and just not accepting the way things are. And so that requires us all to be active citizens in whatever way we can be.
Thanks, Rory. And John, I'm going to give the last word to you.
I suspect it's not going to be the last word. But anyway, can I say, one of the hardest things to achieve is joined up government. I know this from my own experience in the past, and I know it more recently looking at the housing issues more broadly and homelessness in particular. And 6 years ago, the former Minister for Housing asked me to bring together all of the agencies that deal with homelessness to improve cohesion and coordination. I'd only moral authority as a retired civil servant. The first thing I noticed was that 2 departments that should have been part of that group weren't: justice and education. And I got both of them involved. In fairness, justice came on board pretty rapidly. Education sort of had an attitude, what's it to do with us? Well, from listening to Rory's research and so on, the impact of homelessness or the threat of homelessness has a huge impact on children and their educational performance. Even is there a school they can attend, etc. The thing I found most frustrating was, I have to say, dealing with the HSE and trying to get understanding of fairly basic things that are not working at ground level. For example, paying Section 39 organisations on time would make a huge difference. As we've seen recently, you can have cash flow problems surprisingly quickly. Secondly, inconsistencies between different CH areas as to how they interpret basically the same set of principles. And you have to keep, what I find that works is you have to work at a high level, at the level of government or cabinet committees, which is about getting the government focused on a specific objective and getting everybody around the table who are in the business of minding their own patch, because that's the way the system works, to be prepared to make the compromises. We did that successfully on the Action Plan for Jobs 10, 12 years ago, when the government decided 300,000 people lost their jobs in the crash. That's our number one objective as a government. And we made that happen. So it can be done. It could be done in the area of housing. It requires a big investment of limited political capital. And that's why when it comes to what should our priorities be, I have to say I have a slightly contrary view in relation to a referendum on a right to housing. My concern would be that it becomes a distraction and it uses up a lot of valuable time and political capital. The first thing any Secretary General will say to a minister is, you have a certain amount of time and you have a certain amount of political capital. So choose carefully what you decide to really put your energies into. And sometimes you get a new minister who has a long list of things he or she would like to achieve, and it ain't realistic. And they usually learn the hard way that they'll only get a certain amount of their ideas through, or they'll have to accept half measures. And that's the second thing I want to come to. One of the reasons why public policy doesn't work well is that departments and agencies trying to get a new service or an expanded service off the ground end up in a negotiation where they end up with a second best option. Maybe they don't get enough resources. Maybe it's very narrowly targeted and we'll do it as a pilot and we'll see how it goes. So eventually you get it broadened out a bit more, you get a bit more resources. But you never get the thing designed right at the start. And that is a problem. And we come across this all the time in our negotiations with funders. We need X, but we'll give you X minus and do the best you can, sort of attitude. And if we're serious about tackling the need for housing and the demand for housing, we need a much more concentrated and focused approach at the level of government. And that means our advocacy is particularly important in that regard, and not being afraid to actually use very specifics that nobody can contest as your starting point, and join the macro, including what the UN will be doing will put pressure on the Irish government, because they'll have to measure homelessness. Now, we actually will have a much better record in that regard than lots of other countries who'll find all sorts of ways of not measuring homelessness. But that's beside the point. We still have a practical problem to address on the ground, and we're not making a great fist of it. The tragedy is we're actually spending a lot of money on this. We're just not spending it very effectively. We do need to spend more, but we need to get much better at the way we spend the money we are spending. So that's a message for government as well, that we're not afraid to say in whatever forums we find ourselves.
Can we give everybody on the panel a round of applause, please?